Good evening. I think we're on. You're on. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I would also like to acknowledge that we are on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I would say that reading this book has made that seem once again so clear how we are all always on Aboriginal land that has not ever been ceded. I'm really honoured to be here tonight and to be talking about this extraordinary book, The Passion of Private White. I'm just going to add a little to that introduction because I've got it here. I wanted to say that your work has meant so much to us for so long that I wasn't quite sure how to describe it. I think it's created a cosmology of its own, a kind of Watsonian prism through which so many of us see ourselves, our country and our world. I'm sure we all have our favourite books, films, TV sketches, speeches and essays that have been sources of immense pleasure, intellectual thrills, laughs and enlightenment. So we just heard about some of them, so The Recollections of a Bleeding Heart, American Journeys, The Magisterial, The Bush, and of course the Redfern speech, which I'll get back to. To those, I would just like to add, simply because I love to recite their titles, the hilarious, invaluable works on bad language, including Weasel Words, Death Sentence, Bendable Learnings, and my favourite title, Worst Words, a compendium of contemporary cant, gibberish and jargon. Without them, we would be definitely mangling the language worse than I'm going to trying to express how we feel about you. So, to the book. You have said to me about The Passion of Private White. I don't know if there's any overarching theme, maybe how love survives the crush of patriarchy, maybe.
Always a maybe. Did I say that? I know I did. I can't deny it. It is a bit like that. I mean, Neville White was a conscript and he was sent to Vietnam by a patriarchy. And I'd never really thought of it that way. But when you look at who were the influences in the 1950s, well, from the First World War on, but intensely in the 1950s when Neville and I were growing up and into the 60s, they were men, crusty old soldiers in many cases. The RSL was easily the most powerful lobby group in Australia. It was so powerful that Bob Menzies complained about it, even though they all voted for him. It was an utterly male society. The university we went to was run by old soldiers too, although they were sympathetic to Neville's case and let him in without matriculating. But when Neville's number was pulled, his birthday was pulled out of a barrel. It was pulled out by a man wearing an RSL badge, and you know, the sort of deep anti-communism is one thing, but also there was this thing that young men were to follow in their fathers' and grandfathers' footsteps and go off and fight battles, even though Vietnam was a highly questionable battle and based on a lie, which Neville understood. So he resisted. When they were asked after 18 months intensive training, I should point out that had I been born on March the 7th instead of the day before, I would have ended up in Vietnam, very likely. But I wasn't born on March the 7th. All those who were went to Vietnam. Well, some of them would have. So it was a dodgy system, you know. A conscription ballot is not very fair. But when he was asked, his fellow trainees were asked, had they any objection to going to Vietnam, he put his hand up and said he did. He wouldn't go. And he spent 3 weeks working as a kind of medical orderly. They gave him a job in an army hospital, which he said most of the time he spent testing urine samples for venereal disease. because he had a diploma in textile chemistry, which always reminds me of Gough Whitlam saying, you know, they said to me in the RAAF, Whitlam, you've got Latin, you can be a navigator. Anyway, after 3 weeks, he said, he decided, he went through all these agonies of what is the moral thing to do. I don't believe in the war, I think the war is wrong, it's fought on the wrong premises. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese had as much right on their side as the Americans. It's an imperialist war, as he saw it. But then after 3 weeks he thought, well, I've taken this moral position, but isn't friendship a moral position? If these men that I've bonded with as the army makes you, if one or more of them is killed or wounded or suffers some kind of injury, how do I live with myself for the rest of my life? And if I have this feeling about that, then that must be the moral position I ought to take. That ultimately my duty is to these friends. He couldn't stand it any longer, so he told the army he wanted to go. When he arrived, he joined the platoon. There was some doubt with the army commander whether a man who opposed the war should be in the platoon, should be infantry, but he wanted to be infantry, and that's how he ended up. The funny little twist is that because he was late arriving, he wasn't trained in field medicine, which is pretty basic, but it was necessary. Whereas and he was formally in the army as a medic. Now, you have to read the book, and to read the book you've got to buy the book. Well, at this stage. And that is intensive. When he had his horror moment on the battlefield, it was that confusion that intensified the trauma, the loss of control, everything going wrong, and he never got over it.
So, just in terms of word coinage, Don refers in the book to a patriarchy of returned soldiers were running Australia at that time. I just thought that was a very good collective noun. I hadn't heard it before.
No, it's probably not even.
But there's a lot of patriarchies out there.
Yeah.
I'm very interested in this idea of Neville going to war as both insider and outsider. Essentially, he's an anthropologist. Almost by his moral standing is making him an outsider in the war that he goes to participate in. And he's aware that all of these young men who are boys, they're 20, have been conscripted because their number has come up, literally, and they have been taught over 18 months how the bonds of love that are normal moral bonds are to be broken so that they can kill. And what's going to replace them is defence of this band of brothers, these mates. And he's aware of that, and he goes and puts himself in that situation. Yeah,
that's right. I mean, and it's a theme of literature going back to the Iliad. You know, the person who wrote most brilliantly about it, I think, was Marc Bloch, about commanding a troop of French soldiers in the First World War, where he says that everything was about the platoon. Which is why, I don't want to go in this direction, but it's one of the reasons why Anzac, the militarisation of Australian national days now is, I think, so misguided. The Anzac Day was about people from their platoons and battalions getting back together again. And that, not about nationhood or anything else. That was added by Keith Murdoch and a few others. And I think you can't underestimate how powerful the bond is. I learned a lot about it, reading Neville. A platoon works by being a kind of like a swarm, you know, and the movement of one critter makes all the others move as well. One stops, they all stop. One hears something, they all stop and listen to something. And that's how his traumatic event occurred. And this also should be said, I think, that when he and all the rest of the platoon, with no exceptions that I'm aware of, were diagnosed with PTSD 15 years later, or more, it was said by a lot of people, including the old RSL types, that they never fought a real war. It was just a police action. Now, this was the cruelest blow of all. I mean, they went there in the spirit of their fathers, and their fathers effectively said, "What's the matter with you?" In truth, they had more combat-like conditions. They spent more time in combat-like conditions by far than Second World War soldiers on average, by far, because of the way the Australians fought the war. They fought it on the basis of the way the British fought in Malaya, which was this endless patrolling in perfect silence night and day. So they were always immensely tense. And all of them knew someone who was blown to smithereens because they never knew what they were going to step on. It was a hideous war to fight. And it got them all. And it's funny, you know, I mentioned in the book, at around the time when the Vietnam vets were showing these sorts of symptoms, Albert Facey's famous A Fortunate Life came out, and everyone read it, and sold at least 1 million copies. And people were inclined to say, well, if Bert Facey went through Gallipoli, for God's sake, what are these people complaining about? And Facey had said in the book that he had been wounded and hurt inside and all this. But a couple of academics looked at Facey's war record, and I've looked at it since, and he wasn't wounded. He only survived Gallipoli for 2 months. It was enough for 2 brothers to be killed, but he was repatriated out, and it's plain from his war record that the wound, he was hurt in here. He had PTSD, he had shell shock. And the other curious thing about that is the first draft, the final draft of that book, the one we all read, said, after all these years, I feel like I've led a fortunate life. The first draft said, I often think that my life has been wasted.
That was the last line, wasn't it?
That was the last line. Which is exactly what these vets say. There's one who put it best, who said, the thing about it is, this wasn't meant to be my life. You know? And all these other people around here in the northern rivers where he came from, didn't happen to them, but my life has been completely buggered by this. I can't get it out of my head. So, you know.
Just to that, so you describe PTSD in a way that I think, this is going to read a few lines from Don's book, which is a horrible thing to do to an author, but anyway. Such a pithy way of talking about one aspect of PTSD, which sort of expresses the wound to the soul that it is, and the fracturing of a compact between an individual and a society, because I'm going to go to talk about the Yolngu in a second. Your words are that these vets had the feeling that you have betrayed your good character, so your own good character, and that it cannot be retrieved is part of the syndrome for a lot of sufferers. Not only were they among the few in their generation chosen to face death, they were the ones chosen to kill. Dying for one's country is not the worst thing. Killing for it is. And the moral injury tightens the bonds between old soldiers. So I don't know whether you want to go into the story of the event that seems to be at the heart of Neville's PTSD. We don't need to, but...
No, I think they need to buy the book.
Have to buy the book. This is the vanilla version. This is the expurgated version. Well, about that, you have to buy the book. But I think it's Ruth Benedict who you quote saying, anthropology is there to make the world safe for human differences.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in a way, it struck me that Neville was from the start, maybe even as a young man, very aware of the manufacturing of those differences. So he's going off to kill an enemy, and when he gets close, there are, of course, no differences.
Yeah.
And then it sends him back into Australia to go up to the Dongji. Could you perhaps explain how he started to go up and what he wanted to do up there?
Well, I mean, perhaps the first thing that should be said is he had an unusual childhood in that his father was a champion boxer and then a trainer. he trained the great George Bracken, who I idolised as a kid. And his father fought under the name Kid Young. And Neville, as a result, knew, he lived basically on the edge of a gymnasium with his father shouting, you know, left, left, right, left, you know, underneath, over the top, all that sort of thing, and a parrot that repeated everything he said. And a priest who came in regularly to teach Neville the catechism, so it was a very confused child. But he worked on cattle stations as a teenager from where George Bracken had come. So, and he talked to George Bracken's mother, who was a woman from North Queensland, and he became interested in languages and the dying out of languages. And so he was aware of human difference in a way that most of us weren't. And I think he always, whatever, he's a deep moralist from the beginning, although he used to punch people.
And hit you in your solar plexus.
Yeah, you tensed the moment he was approaching, because he'd sort of do that to you, or get you in a headlock or something, and then ask you how you were. But so he knew whatever moral position he took was always going to be somehow connected to Aboriginal injustice. So, but anyway, he became a geneticist, and he flew through university, won the university medal, and took off for Arnhem Land, or the Northern Territory, and spent a year or two going around to various groups and fingerprinting them and making other measurements now, which would be seen as a disgraceful intrusion by many people. But your fingerprints, I didn't know this. I spent about 5 years trying to understand genetics for this book. But your fingerprints actually contain extraordinary information about your DNA. And so basically what he found with his fingerprinting has been verified by DNA tests since. And in the end, to cut this short, a famous Yolngu man, David Burramura on Elcho Island, said, if you want to meet people who understand their land as intimately as their forefathers and mothers, in the traditional way, you must go to this place just west of the Mitchell Ranges, and there are two clans, two intermarrying clans, the Ratungu and the Wagaluk, and they've only just formed an outstation. Until 1970, they were still not wandering. The seasonal movements they followed, they knew the land absolutely intimately, they were living the traditional life, albeit the Reverend Harold Shepperton would arrive with supplies from time to time in his little homemade plane. But they'd never come in, they'd never gone to the missions, they'd never gone to the cattle stations. They were deeply conservative people. And they were living, as Donald Thompson, who was the first person to walk through there in the 1930s, found them. In fact, the two old men of the group Thompson had met in about 1935 or 36 when they were young men.
Amazing.
So in the 1960s, there was hardly a hunter-gathering group that didn't have an anthropologist attached to them. They spread out everywhere, following the example of Levi-Strauss and Malinowski and people like this. And the idea was you're a participant observer, you sit there. It's funny, Malinowski was a participant observer, but he wore puttees and a pith helmet and just blending in, you know. And he was about 6'4", and he was up in the Trobriand Islands. But this was the idea, and they were rather heroic, this generation, while the rest of us were, you know, smoking dope or something. They were out there, and you just observed and copied down everything you heard. And so that's where Neville ended up. He flew in there and introduced himself, and stayed, and observed and observed and observed, and went out walking with them. So now, in fact, now the old men and the generation below them are all dead. He knows more about the land that they walked and the sites and the lines and all the rest than the young men at Doinji.
And he's passing that on to them?
He is. they asked him to come up and show them, because he went out with I went out with him once with his GPS. I had to stay in the truck and boil to death while he sat out there with Tom Gunnerman. And
you had to be there so that you didn't overhear.
Yeah, I wasn't allowed to see what was happening. It was quite amusing in its way. But Neville had his GPS, so he's GPSed all the songlines, you know, he knows where they all go.
Amazing.
I
just want to talk about time a little bit. So these people have first stopped being seasonally nomadic in 1970, which is very recent. But they have withstood a series of cultural exchanges of varying degrees of exchange or violence for a long time. So could you just give us, I want to ask you about Tom, but before that I want to just set the scene of who these people are and their interactions with Macassans and then with the varying waves of white incursion.
Yeah, well the Yolngu occupy northeast Arnhem Land. The most famous of them are the ones at Nhulunbuy and Galarrwuy, Yunupingu and those people. They're the coastal people who Tom believed didn't know anything. All wretched people who abused the traditional way. The coastal people had been in touch with the Macassans for at least 200 years and possibly more. So a lot of the Macassan language and Macassan material culture had come their way. Some of it had filtered down to these groups at Doinji, like the Macassan pipes, a lot of Macassan words, the shovel-nosed spear, those sorts of things. But they'd also gone through wars against the pastoralists, which were horrific, truly horrific. There was an old woman there when I first went, a really old woman, who told Neville when she was younger that she had been, that these white stockmen had come when she was a child, and the adults had said, quick, get up the trees. The women had run, the children went up the trees. From the trees they saw the stockmen shoot the men. Then they started shooting the children out of the trees, which she said fell like rotten fruit. And there's something in that metaphor which makes it true, you know what I mean? And the women went up into the Mitchell Ranges and hid out there while the men fought the battle on the ground. Eventually the pastoralists left. So there's that sort of hideous trauma. There are other examples in there running right up to today. Talk about intergenerational trauma.
So then there's the missions.
Then there's the missions. So the Anglicans arrive in about 1910 and run basically concentration camps. Slavery, even the Northern Territory Police called it in some instances. The Methodists were wiser and more humane, and an awful lot of history, as we know, has to do with individuals. Just one personality can change everything, and there was this couple called the Shepherdson came up from Adelaide in about 1930, and he built a plane out of a catalogue. He got it sent in bits. Never flown a plane in his life, stuck it together and flew it for another 40 years, carrying only a bit of masking tape to patch up the wings if it got a bit dodgy. And there are people there now who will say, you know, the missions, we shouldn't dismiss the missions, that there was a lot wrong with what they did, but they stayed. That's the first thing. They didn't come up and be made a skin brother and go home and brag about it in Balmain or somewhere. They stayed and they understood and they learned the language and they started schools and they found things for useful money making, like art, alligators, crocodile skins and all this sort of stuff. And in a way, Neville ends up becoming a kind of anthropological missionary. He becomes a sort of community builder. But the missions also, because as they became sedentary, disease spread through these places. You know, there were leprosy and yaws and diseases which, in a country like this, seem quite bizarre. but also, incredible dental problems and rheumatic heart disease and diabetes. We know the story. So that's. I'll have to take the next question. I'm wandering here.
Yes, no, I'm not wandering at all. So we've got this group of Yolngu who settle at Donji for the first time in millennia. Presumably they're used to being moving seasonally, and that allows them to interact with other clans. If there's conflict within, they can blow off steam by moving. They fight other clans and so on, and all of a sudden they find themselves in, and they've resisted the missions, they've survived the pastoralists, the miners. I don't know whether they were there yet.
The next, yes.
They're going to resist them, so they're there, and Neville turns up there, but they're dealing with the challenges of living together, I suppose, in this new sedentary way. And your book has this beautiful kind of powerful but also delicate narrative arc in it where there's a conflict between Tom, who is an elder leader of the Yolngu, and Cowboy, who has a different history. Maybe that's a way to talk about those.
Yeah,
those
it's the Ratangu were the owners of the land, and the Wagalak were the managers of the land, and they lived basically together in two camps, a little way apart. Ratangu, Yolngu society is divided into two moieties, everything from human beings down to plants and animals. The Ratangu were Yiricha, and the Wagalak Dua. Yiricha marry Dua, Dua marry Yiricha, Dua don't marry Dua, Yiricha don't marry Yiricha. And these were the standard intermarrying clans with a couple of others. But there were various branches of the Ratangu, and it gets unbelievably complex. I mean, the Yolngu kinship system is just mind-blowingly complex, brilliant, but I don't understand it. I tried. And what it does give you, knowing how complex it is, gives you an idea of how easily it was disturbed. So the moment someone walked through there, it becomes, you've got to explain this somehow. And you can see how Europeans just blundered through the whole thing. Anyway, where do I start here? This man, Tom, is the traditionalist, never left his land. But when I arrived, there was a man called Cowboy who'd gone to the cattle stations, but he was also Ratangu. But he'd been raised out of cattle stations and in the missions. Why is it doing that to me? And you can tell someone who's been on the cattle stations from someone who's led traditionally just by their body shape. Cowboy's this huge man, wears a singlet, big hat, big boots. He's got two wives and who attend to him, and his spears and his gun. It was a strange moment because Cowboy had been involved in a ceremony at Doenji and he made a few mistakes, and this is really dangerous. And Tom hated him not only because he wanted to turn Doenji into a cattle station, but because he thought he was he was a very important ceremonial man, but he wanted to do things which were risky. So when I arrived, Cowboy was sitting, as he had done for a long while, trying to just drive Tom mad. But he was also worried sick that Golka was coming for him.
Yes. Tell us about Golka.
Golka is this fearsome personage. Most anthropologists, well, all the ones I've ever met, say he exists. He's a shapeshifter and he kills people. And so Cowboy was sitting facing the bush with his rifle and spears, and then he got a spotlight at night and he had the wife moving it backwards and forwards to see if Golka was coming. Anyway, this standoff went on for months and even years, with Cowboy trying to move Tom, and Tom would get freaked out and go into Nullarbor and come back again. There was a psychological war about whether the place stayed traditional or became a cattle station, but they're all dead now. the interesting thing about Tom, to give it an example of culture and sorcery, I mean, one of the problems the community always found, these men, was that it's very hard to get women to move to Dorngie because it's hard, and the men are all magic people. I mean, they're big into magic and sorcery, and it's a dangerous place to be, and they'd rather be somewhere else. But Tom had one brother who died when he was about 45, just out of the blue, Jimmy, which was probably parasites which caused heart blockages, but they said, no, it was sorcery. And then the charismatic one, who would have been the leader of the place, Ilarama, couldn't stand the tension anymore and left. Came back, working for the NLC, giving them advice and the mining companies about where the pipeline could go, and they thought this was insane. They said, if you go up in that helicopter and do that, you'll die. Terrible things will happen. He went up in the helicopter crashed. He said, we see what happens. So Tom was driven by the fact that his brothers had died in this way, and 2 others had been killed as well. So Tom inherited accidentally, basically, and was not made for leadership, but he was deeply conservative. And that affects a lot of the way the community evolved.
So, can I ask you a question at that point? When you meet Tom, Tom is taking pills, which are for anxiety.
Yeah.
So we have the vets up there who are all taking their pills.
Yeah, they rattled with them.
Rattled with their pills. And Tom is also taking pills out of anxiety, partly because of Cowboy's threat.
Yeah.
But I just want to read something very interesting. So we've got essentially 2 groups with some sort of PTSD meeting. And this is how you describe what could be thought of as PTSD in the Yolngu community. Terror, this is Marshall McLuhan who says, terror is the normal state of any oral society, for in it everything affects everything all the time. And then you say, maybe not, but given the terror of Gorka and sorcery, the fear instilled in circumcision and other ceremonies, and the horrors in stories passed down from the frontier, it seemed possible that the hunters and foragers at Dorngie might suffer from some chronic form of PTSD. So I guess the book is this kind of glorious, inglorious meeting of these worlds, of the vets who want to be bonded together and are going up to help, to build a school, to build houses, to sort out plumbing that the rest of our society hasn't done. And I'm wondering whether the Dorngie, whether Tom, whether they perceived how much they were helping the vets.
I'm not sure. I think...
Was it a two-way thing?
I think it was effectively, but I'm not sure that it was consciously on the part of the Yolngu people. I think they were immensely grateful, but they didn't show it in ways that were satisfying to the vets sometimes. There's such a profound cultural difference. It used to what drove the vets mad more than anything else was they never said thank you. You know.
Is that not a cultural practice?
No, you don't say thank you. No. And I think they felt, well, I mean, in the end, like so much else, you'd think, well, in the end, why the hell should they be thanking us? But there was something weird about, you hand them a cup of tea, how many sugars. We were waiting on them, and they just sort of take it as, one particular Chris was very surly. But then
so you spent a lot of time making tea, I understand, because you're not such a great builder.
Yeah, anything I built would have fallen down.
But good at tea.
I was useless. I hadn't been a soldier. No warrior instinct at all. And I couldn't build, but I could make tea. I'm quite good with a fire. So they watched me burn my hands, spill boiling water on my legs. But it's funny that tiny little cultural habit of saying thank you used to really irritate the vets. They'd bite their lips. You might say thank you, they'd say under their breath. But they were... I don't know even that the vets thought it was therapy, but it plainly was. And their partners were happy to see their backs, when they went off for 2 or 3 months of every year. And they were marvellous builders, and what they did was, they sort of would demonstrate in a day what could be done by a competent and willing person, which the bureaucracy and the contractors couldn't do. They would do plumbing for $200 that contractors had quoted $14,000 for.
These are often fly-in, fly-out contractors, aren't they?
Yeah, they fly in.
Grotesque about it.
Fly in for anything, and they never. I mean, this is this thing with the difference between a missionary and a bureaucracy or a contractor. Is that the missionaries would ring first, as any of us would. Say, look, I'm coming out from Balmain, it's a 40-minute flight on the plane. It's going to cost $1,200. Perhaps I could bring you something. Do you need anything? Tea, something like that. A spare part, but no, they would fly up with one person in it and do one thing. When they wouldn't have the spare part, they'd fly back and come back again. The money's just going down the tube. You need diesel, something like that. So insane things happen. They built this wonderful workshop, which perhaps we should talk about in a minute.
Yes.
They put up this workshop, and it was about as wide as this, 3 times as wide as this room. You could drive 2 Leopard tanks through it with ease, and it had doors at either end. And a man flew out from Darwin, an inspector, and said, "You can't use this workshop, there are no exit signs." And this is sitting out on the savannah, an endless savannah. It's just, there's nothing for miles and miles and miles. You wouldn't see a house in 3 hours of driving in any direction, but you've got to have an exit sign at either end. So the veteran got the exit signs, and he flew back in a month or 2 and said, "Okay, you can have the exit signs." And about a week later, the kids had put rocks through the exit signs anyway, as you'd expect. But that was the sort of level of it. A contractor put in a septic tank for $12,000, and it overflowed within 12 months. It was a hideous mess, and the vets dug it out. And it was a 44-gallon drum cut in half that he'd put in. So the rip-offs and the abuse is unbelievable. So.
I can't think of a neat segue here, but I want to talk about women in this society. So we've got a bunch of men wounded by patriarchy and war going into this society where the men are no longer doing the usual fighting that they've been doing. And this is a polygynous society, so the men will take many wives, sometimes extremely many wives. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between polygyny and warfare?
Well, they're closely related in that, if you needed women, you went and got them, if necessary.
Got?
Stole. Took. The wonderful old woman up there, Betty, had been, just to give an example, Betty had gone off for the wrong, she was Waggaluk, and she'd gone off with a Waggaluk man down near the Walker River. I don't know how they find out what's going on, but they know everything. They knew that Julia Gillard had been deposed. I don't know how they knew. Not Julia Gillard, when Kevin Rudd had, So it didn't matter out there, but they said, "Oh, you've got a new Prime Minister." And they think, how do you know that? I mean, anyway, they knew. But anyway, Bill Tarama goes down, sets off, and he came back. This is long before I got there. And he came back with Betty. He took her off the Waggaluk man, I don't know how, and brought her up where she belonged, married to a Ratangu man, that's him. And she's still there. But she used to go down every night, you'd see her go past, on the way down to give Tom his meal. And then she'd go back to the women's camp. Tom would just take them and never say thank you, of course. But she would stop and go like this to Neville, who would then go and give her 2 cigarettes, and then she'd go on happily. And she's still going. She would weigh at least 4 stone 3, I'd say.
So just going back in history, you write that, when you read this book, and it's clear that the women live quite separately from the men.
Yeah.
Single women, widows, women whose men have gone somewhere else are all in one lot. And traditionally, the women, when they were moving seasonally and most of this also still now, are hunting, gathering and preparing about 80% of the food.
At certain times of the year, but on average they would 3/4 of the food would be
and getting the firewood and bringing up the children and looking after the old people. So there's an enormous amount of work and purpose involved in that life.
Yeah.
And the men, and some of these men have 20 wives, and some have 10 and so on. So there's a lot of underloved, underoccupied men who are, and the vets are building them a shed. You can stop me if I'm being too simplistic here.
No.
But that's a society that's really riven by it's missing, in a way, warfare, bad as that would be, to occupy the men. And then the vets are up there, having been so destroyed by it.
Mm.
It's a very interesting meeting of damage and purpose and history.
Yeah. William Helps Rivers, the man who did, Pat Barker wrote her trilogy about, was an anthropologist in Solomon's, I think. And he basically came to the conclusion that when headhunting stopped, when they stopped being warriors, headhunters, that something went completely out of their lives. There was nothing left, and they were the aimless, hopeless, sort of as if PTSD-stricken men who sat around with nothing to do. Mm. And he saw in them similar symptoms to the shell shock victims he treated in the First World War. Now, I think you see much the same in this community, that the young men, so long as they have the ceremonies going, that gives everyone something. But the trouble with the homelands has always been, what do you do from day to day to day? And the same squabbles arise, and the same frustrations as would have arisen traditionally. But traditionally they would hive off into bands until things had settled down. Now when they want to hive off, you're not going to walk away, so it revolves around who's got the four-wheel drive, if any of them are going at all. I mean, this camp, there must have been 40 or 50 worn-out old Toyotas. So at Doingy, it was 99% of the time it was all kept. People found a way to get out and leave the trouble behind. There were only, I should say, at Doingy, unlike, say, the hub town, Gabwiak, it's dry, there's no alcohol. For the most part, the intervention actually led to drugs coming there, because all the drug takers left, got out of the hub towns and went to the homeland. There's no carver, unless they sometimes bring it in. And there's never been a suicide or a murder or even a serious assault.
Yeah, it's extraordinary.
Which is very rare. But I think that's because of the attention that they got. That really, the place had some kind of dynamic. There was a sense they were going somewhere. The men came and went whenever they could. But it holds together by a thread, but the thread was enough, I think.
I'm looking at the time, and we could go on for a long time. I've got one more question, and then we're going to open up for questions. My question is about where to from here. How are the people who live at Doingy now feeling? If they know everything, what do they think of the voice? And how are they feeling about the future now? Is it much the same? And how is Neville feeling about that?
They wouldn't give two hoots about the voice. I wouldn't think that the voice is even a matter for national discussion. They'd vote for it, but they wouldn't know. Around the coastal Yongle would, but the isolation of these people would be self-imposed. No. They sit in a kind of, there is this there is this hub town, which is the most desolate place imaginable, despite the efforts of people of goodwill and everything else. But it's about 18 or 19 different clans are represented there. It's constant bickering and squabbling and drug abuse, and it's dry, but it's not a good place. And no one wants to go there, but they will when things get bad at Doenji. So the future for Doenji is that it's very strange. I went there in 2019, just before COVID, and it looks like a strange village sitting out on the savannah, and it looked like it did look like a village. Neville was getting around, he looked like the parish priest, going from house to house, seeing everybody was. And I thought, it's rather marvellous. There was a big blue going on between two brothers, but not a violent one. That was one of the problems, is that the old men of the Ratungu mob, and we didn't mention this in the patriarchy, but they kept these young men down, and that led to immense frustration. So there's this wonderful man there called Ricky, of enormous potential and gorgeous bloke, but the frustrations just drove him insane. All the promises were broken. To give you a quick example, this workshop was built for the men, but they could never get someone to teach. The government never provided them. So that all the hope is invested in this workshop, because to become a mechanic or a carpenter or something like that gives them a chance to move from there, to have proper jobs, proper money, all that sort of thing. But the bureaucracy failed again. There was that, plus the frustration that he had no ceremonial power. He should have been running the community, basically, but he couldn't for traditional reasons. So if you look at the long grass where Ricky ends up, in Catherine, it's full of people who are, it is true, victims of, in the end, they're all victims of colonialism, if you like, but they're also victims of the boundaries that traditional society imposes on the young men getting away from old men's authority, old men getting away from young men's playing up, and so on. It's immensely complicated.
Well, it's not a complicated book to read, it's an absolute joy. I think that you weave so deftly through so many different ways of seeing and so many different knowledges in the book. So white and black, anthropological, historical, political, mythological, psychiatric, and poetic. It doesn't read like that, but all of those things are freighted through the book, and it's very beautiful. I think it's another major contribution to Australian culture, and we are all the richer for it. So thank you.
Thank you, Anna.
I believe that there are microphones around, but we can probably hear you anyway. If there are questions, please ask them. We can keep going, as you may have noticed, so if there are no questions, we can probably... Yes?
So I have a question about bureaucracy. We know that Neville goes to war because of his name coming out of a hat, and we know that the Yolngu people are, the people at Doenji are plagued by failures of bureaucracy, and I would just like to hear John speak about, what is bureaucracy and how does it damage us?
I'm afraid I have to repeat the question for the internet audience. It's a very good question about the fact, about bureaucracy and its relationship to white and black Australia. In white Australia, the lottery, kind of obscene lottery system of the draft in the 60s meant that Neville's number came up, and then we have the failures of white bureaucracy in trying to, or not trying to, supply the needs of the Doenji.
Yeah. I think probably the best way to describe the failing of democracy is bureaucracy. Democracy too, for God's sake. No, it's probably what I said before, that a non-bureaucratic approach to this is to ring before you turn up with nothing. A bureaucratic approach is to ring. And they would walk in, I don't know whether it survived Lizzie's editing, they would walk. I was up there in 2019, and about 3 planes arrived, and these people just marched straight through, like they owned the joint. And that was the thing. And it's not their fault. You don't have to be particularly precious about it, but it's not their place. And they never bother about like who's in charge here, and do you mind if we come? They were coming from the health department, or all bringing necessary services, but never telling you in advance. So they would arrive to fill out their CDEP forms without telling anybody they were coming. And the forms weren't filled out because the school teacher never got around to because they couldn't fill them out. That's big English. One bloke flew out there one day and he erected a letterbox. It's still sitting there, this letterbox. No one's ever put a letter in it, but it was a whole day's work, plus a plane trip,
So how did the Doinji communicate with bureaucracy or not?
Well, I don't know. Bureaucracy seemed to be the one organisation that they couldn't somehow telepathically know what was going on. Bureaucracy found a way to foul them on that. And it was Soviet in its follies. I mean, it was quite incredible. And I think one way to cure it would be to turn off the air conditioning in Nhulunbuy and probably in the four-wheel. That was the other thing. It is so relentlessly arrogant or insensitive. Like if you arrive and there are men trying to get cars that haven't gone for 10 years going, and you arrive in a Land Cruiser worth $120,000 or something, you can't and then drive away. And Yungel would do it too. They're on their way to a big meeting in Mataranka or something. Well, you can't help but look at that thing and think, you could have had 6 Land Cruisers for about $25,000 each.
Or proper teachers full-time.
Or a teacher that would keep a trade teacher going for a year.
Or for the children.
So it's the profound insensitivity of it. And as one long-time member of the Northern Territory Parliament said to me, he said, look, you can't get a decent bureaucrat in Canberra. What do you think we get up here? Or you would go into these massive buildings in Nhulunbuy, beautifully air-conditioned, huge windows, incredible IT stuff that they couldn't work, with someone there called the solutions broker. And she didn't have a clue. She didn't know where the place was. She thought we were talking about Dumaji. And Dumaji, as you know, is down at the bottom of the Gulf. It's in Queensland. That was an interesting meeting because that one of the vets who was with us, the big burly Bjelke Peterson voting Dave Glyde, he let fly and said, I'm ashamed, I'm just a big dumb bastard and I'm ashamed of what goes on here. And it was grotesque. A solution broker. You say, what is, have you got a solution? That's an interesting thing in a way because there aren't solutions. I think that's the huge mistake we make is we think that we actually we need a solution. That's what meetings and committees and bureaucrats say. We need a solution. There aren't solutions. You just fix it. You fix what needs to be fixed, and you just keep going and keep going, and you do what is required. You don't say this is. Neville never thought this place was utopia. He just thought, although some people accused him of utopian ambitions, but he just thought, well, I'll just do what is a good idea to be done, and when that needs fixing, I'll fix that. And if this person's got bad teeth, I'll try and get his teeth fixed, and so on. So you don't end up with a perfect place, but you end up with a place where no one has died due to violence, and the women are safe, and ceremonies are alive, the language is alive, and a lot of the knowledge is still alive, like probably 95% of it.
How much of that is due to being able to keep the bureaucracy at bay?
Well, in a way, it is. Some of the bureaucrats are often very nice people, but I think these remote places have a tendency to attract empire builders. Even if they don't go there as empire builders, they tend to become empire builders. And see, the funny thing about the intervention was that it was no good for the place. accidentally flushed out a horrible, I mean, a cowboy was in town saying, oh, there's child abuse going on out of Dointy. I mean, so the army and the police arrived and they were just horrified. They couldn't conceive of such a thing. But what they did was flush out a relationship was the wrong relationship, and that man was banished and the woman was banished, and God knows it was a terrible mess. Thank you, intervention. But the one thing that the intervention did do, and this is how it all works, there was a woman there who was only there for 3 months, and she was running it out of Nhulunbuy. She'd retired from the public service and had become a grain nomad, but they rang her up and said, can you run northeast Arnhem Land for the intervention? But she was fantastic, not because she was particularly capable, but because she tried. And she went around to all, she slept out there, for God's sake. No one had ever spent a night there. No politician in the Northern Territory had ever spent a night at this place. But she stayed out there for 2 or 3 nights, and she got to know the people. She just tried. And really that's the thing. I think their depression, the depression they feel and their frustrations they feel is that people are always coming and they're always going. They never stay. So there's someone always driving away, usually in a nice car. And they promise a lot, and they always say, will you come back? And you always feel sick because you think maybe I won't be able to. They're amazingly hospitable people. I mean, they might, if you play up, put a spell on you or spear through you. But they're lovely people, and Thompson talked about that in the 1930s, sort of wandering through this. And there's a lovely passage he wrote where he said, you know, these people would just emerge from out of the trees, the men leading the way. Somewhere in deep time, the men decided that they would carry the spears and go ahead, and the women would carry absolutely everything else and follow behind. But he said they would be friendly. But they had 2 Rotunga men went with them, calling out, we're with a good white man. He's not, don't worry about anything. Everything's fine. You're safe. It's all right. And then they would just appear. And then they would disappear back into the bush. And he says, there's a beautiful passage where he says, you know, I can't bear to think of their passing. These people are how we have been for most of human history. Hunting and foraging. With a most, I try to describe it at Tom's funeral, where they sing about everything. I mean, they come from everywhere to sing these songs. They come bouncing down the airstrip in their dilapidated trucks with lights pointing in all directions, and then you hear them singing and your heart nearly stops. And as it goes on, I mean, I just stayed right through a funeral, and it's for the beginning of one, which is quite extraordinary. But they sing about all these songs, about everything. They sing about, you know, kangaroos and emus and turkeys and various birds, every kind of bird, and fish, and a particular kind of fish, Saratoga fish, which are big fish, and little fish that swims along the side of the streams and gets in and out of reeds and is hard to catch. And grasses and trees and places, and I mean, it's the most. I thought I had some understanding of how intimate the relationship, what the cosmology was actually like, but when you hear, because Devils recorded all these songs and what they're about, Manichae they called them. It's only when I suddenly realised that it is so intimate you can't. It's indescribable, and you know, Tom would say to these miners, you know, you think you can go around these sites. You can't go around them because they're joined. You can't do that. And they are. The whole landscape is alive. And he would also say, I own it all. This is mine. You go away. And they showed him some rocks that they wanted to take. These are the rocks we're looking for. He said, take those rocks and can put them back where they belong, which is a fantastic idea. Leave them there. And but he'd say, I not only own the land, but I own the sky. It's all, everything. It's mine. Don't get near it. And what's underneath? Then I remember when Telstra came, they wanted to put through a cable, and Tom knew he didn't trust them. But he said, in the end, and he tapped his leg, he said, you can put it in this deep, no deeper. there and he tapped his shin. Of course, they were already digging at the depth they wanted, but just ignored him. But
are there any more questions? Or we can finish up and you can ask Don questions when you buy his book in the room at the back. I just thought maybe to finish, do you think you could read the last paragraph of the book?
It's very hard.
Is this to give you, or is it to...
It's hard while holding a microphone.
I'll
manage, I promise.
This is the very, very last paragraph of the book. It's just exquisitely beautiful, and it kind of leads you in a circular way, in the way that it also leads you out of it.
It comes just before a picture of Dulatarama showing Neville how you throw a spear so it'll go right through someone. With a special stone tip which hurts like hell and makes it bleed profusely, you know. They like
lick, yeah?
Yeah, you lick it first, yeah. If you're ever needing a spear, it worked. Better than the Macassan spears, he said. So just this last bit. No one can say what Luigi will be in 5 years' time, or 10 or 100. The sites will remain sacred, of course. The southeast breeze will rustle the leaves and the coal will continue to call. The coal is this, I think they come down to Sydney, coals. They make a weird noise in the morning and they're always watching you. You know, you think they're not there, and they are. And they're very important to Luigi. But it's just as certain that the mining companies will want to frack and drill, and some young all with ceremonial links to the place will wonder if they might move in for the royalties. Neville's oral and visual record of the old people's fight against mining and his documented knowledge of the country will be vital defences against all other claims. But the best insurance will be the place itself, the physical proof of the clan's determination to stay and strike a balance between the old ways and the new. The people have not left. Whether it endures or fades, Doenji will never be less than a refuge and always a miracle, an epic of perseverance. The houses, the school and the workshop, the cooking shelters, the laundries and the old caravan will go on speaking for the dogged hope that put them there.